Yeah, I'm wondering if he's going to just try to push it over there, a little fade into that hole location.
Oh, definitely that. Oh, there you go.
Like that!
Oh, you're kidding me.
God, it went in the hole.
Wow. I haven't seen, that might be a first.
So what I asked you, Nick, what does he need to do after that bogey at 1?
I didn't know.
There's the answer.
I didn't have an answer.
Start dunking shots.
That was amazing. I think that's a first for me.
That's a first for me, Nick.
Yeah.
It was in the
How
hole.
about
Farmers
this?
Insurance Open.
1, 2. It's
And
perfect.
Down.
And whoop. Oh, you know, what a place to freeze it. 20 questions. Did it stay or come out?
Oh, my.
Right, that is unbelievable.
Look at him.
Oh, some things are so close, but not quite close enough, huh? No points there. We're starting a series today called So Close. And in this, it's going to be a loose series. And for the most part, I want it to be a little more fun. Today, I'm just warning you now, going to get deep. Today, the more I started preparing, the more I realized this is not a summertime topic, but we're going to tackle it anyhow. We're going to look at phrases that you might hear around a church, things that are so close to the truth, things that some of us actually believe, but the more we start exploring them, the more we realize they're not quite right. They're not 100%. So back in 1999, a lot of you will remember this, NASA sent a probe to Mars, and this was all over the news when it happened. And what happened is this probe is constantly sending telemetry data back to NASA, and NASA is constantly sending it course corrections. The problem is the probe was sending the data back in metric, and NASA's computers were processing the data in standard. So instead of centimeters, inches, you know what I mean? And so they ended up getting just a little bit off. How far off were they? They were 0.00025% off in their calculations because of this. To give you an idea, if you were to pull out of our parking lot today and drive to the mall in Duluth and park there, that's about a 16-mile drive. At the end of that 16 miles, you would be under 2.5 inches off. This is close, right? It is a distance, when Mars hits their closest point to Earth, it is approximately 34 million miles away, a little over 34, somewhere between 34 and 35 at its closest point. I don't know how close they were, but I'm assuming that's when NASA would try to launch, when it was at that point. This would be off by about 80 kilometers of that. That sounds like a success at first, doesn't it? The probe exploded on entry. It hit the atmosphere. Instead of skimming across the atmosphere and entering it slowly, it hit the atmosphere too hard and was destroyed. A little bit off can sometimes do a whole lot of damage. That is especially true in truth. And we live in an area, a time, where people tend to see truth as being something relevant, something they can decide for themselves. I do not agree with that. Truth is an absolute. You can think different, but that doesn't change what truth is. And if you're just a little bit off in truth, and especially in religion, when you're talking to people, they'll make statements like, well, I believe. Hey, that's nice, but what if we don't get to decide? What if God gets to define himself? Just being a little bit off can sometimes cause some damage. And one area that can happen is when it comes to suffering, it's in the area of God's will. And that can be a very difficult thing. We're going to tackle an incredibly deep topic today. And it is not a comfortable topic, it's a painful one. But I think by the end of it, it will hopefully give you some tools that will help you throughout life and help you understand our faith a little bit more. Why is this important? Well, there's a pastor named Larry Osborne, and he wrote a book called 10 Dumb Things Smart Christians Believe. And he talks about some of these things that are so close. And he talks in the book about a time that his wife had developed cancer. And they're starting treatments for her, and they're asking people to pray. And people in the church would come up and make comments to them that were supposed to be helpful and encouraging. And one of the ones is, well, you know, everything happens for a reason. That did a lot more harm than help for Larry Osborne and his wife. Because what's the implication of it? The implication is God doesn't really care about you. He's got some sort of plan, and if he has to tread all over you for it, that doesn't bother him at all. Is that an accurate view of who God is or how he views us? And so this was a very painful thing when people would say this to them. We're going to approach this topic today in a very different sort of way than what you might expect. I wrote 3 sermons for this week. I'm only going to give you the shortest one. The first 2 were way too much teaching. But we're going to approach this from the last scripture I would have expected when I started. We're going to look at one verse, and it's from Genesis chapter 1. And you guys know my strange habit where you see underlined words. I ask you to say those with me. So then it says, "Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, after our likeness, so they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the cattle and over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move on the earth." This is something different. Theologians call this theological dominion, that God gave humanity the role of instituting his reign on earth. Now, to understand this, some people read this verse and think we have control. That's not really an accurate view. In the olden days there, in the days where much of the Bible was written, it was not uncommon to have a great empire, and there would be an emperor, and he would appoint kings to rule under him. And they were called vassal kings. We are vassals here. It's so funny because I wrote this whole message. I had this all done on Friday and printed out. And yesterday, I start looking at or listening to a podcast while I'm cooking, and I hear this podcaster make the statement, it's like we're middle management. He talked about the whole issue the day after I had written. He said, we're middle management in the company. We don't get to decide the mission statement for the company. We don't get to decide the direction. We don't get to decide what products we make. But the senior management says, this is our mandate, and he hands it to us and says, carry it through. I thought that's a really good image of what God calls us to do. So if we are called to be the middle managers, if we are called to rule on this, there are some implications that come from that are going to be important to our discussion today. And here's the thing I want you to keep in the back of your mind as we're going through this concept today. When life is hard, it's easy to blame God for his lordship of the world. We don't always stop to take a look at the middle managers. Is it something I myself have done that has caused this pain? Is it something that another person has done that has caused this pain? And where is God in the middle of our pain? We're going to try to approach a few different topics very, very mildly today. Some of it is going to have to wait for other days to really get answers. But we're going to look at some of this and how it all comes together. And hopefully the next time we're talking to a hurting person, we will avoid using the phrase, well, everything happens for a reason. What's the first thing we're going to look at today? We have this idea of dominion. Everything we're going to look at is going to be under this idea of dominion. First thing we're going to look at is we have free will. I'm sorry, I know that offends some people to say. There are 2 major schools of thought in American Christianity today. Both are Christian. No matter where a person is on the spectrum, they are our brother and sister. We're going to be sitting next to each other in heaven, so we may as well learn how to get along down here. But the 2 schools of thought are this. There is, before I even describe them, let me just say where we're unified. Both schools of thought believe God is God. He has every right to make whatever choices he wants. He can do with us as he will. He is God. Both agree God is able to do whatever he wants. He has the power. He has the authority. He has the power. God can do anything He wants. We're all in agreement on that. And that's what matters. Where we start to differ is when it comes down to how often does He exercise it. And there's one school of thought called Calvinism, and it traces its back to the 1600s. An incredible guy, one of my three heroes of the faith, a man named John Calvin. And if you're Baptist, Reformed, Presbyterian, all of those are going to come from this family tree. And in Calvin's view, God fully exercises that authority every chance He gets. Now on the other end, there's what's called the Arminian point of view, and Wesley wasn't quite all the way to Arminius, but in that direction. And the Arminian point of view is that God fully has this power, but doesn't always exercise it. And we'll try to unpack that a little bit more as we go along. Why does that get important? Because my mom was in concentration camps. She was a war orphan. And I am not willing to look at a person that was in a camp. I'm not willing to look at a survivor of the Holocaust, look him in the eyes and say, well, that was just God's plan for you. That's what He wanted. I'm not willing to do that. But how do you get to that place? How do you understand it? Because while God didn't do this, He also didn't stop it. We have some wrestling to do here if we want to be honest about our faith, if we want to really think. We have to really work through some of this. So let me offer you one thing, and I'm going to go from this huge image of the Holocaust down to just something really tiny, and I don't mean to be flippant about it. This is just something we can relate to. I am not minimizing in any way the pain of the Holocaust. Just a flippant little way that we can visualize, because it's something many of us in this room, if not all of us, have experienced. Most of us in this room either have been a parent or have been a kid for somebody, right? Parents and kids, there's always a little bit of a power struggle, isn't there? The parent has the authority, but the child still has some free will. So what happens? It comes time maybe for church on a Sunday morning, maybe to get them ready for school on Monday morning, and you teach your kids for the first 4 years of their life what to wear, how to dress for the weather, what is appropriate, what matches, what doesn't. And then you have your 4-year-old who you're trying to get ready, and you lay out their outfit for them. And you tell them, you are now big enough. You go and you put on your clothes. And they come out wearing this. And you look at them and you say, that's not what Mommy and Daddy picked out for you here. You are the parent. You fully have the authority to tell them to go change. You have the power, if you wanted to. You are strong enough. You could wrestle them and manhandle them and put them in the clothes you want. And sometimes we've been known to do that. Sometimes we don't. Why? Why don't you? Now, if we're deeply honest with ourselves, sometimes because we just don't feel like having the fight. That ain't God. But there are other reasons. I want the kid to learn. Let them see what happens when they go out. Let them see how uncomfortable they are. Let them learn that sometimes mom and dad know what they're doing. Maybe it brings them pleasure. This is what they want to wear. This makes them happy. And I want them to be happy. And it's not hurting anything, so let them wear it. Sometimes we have the power, we have the authority, and we don't carry it through. Maybe God does the same for us. And that's the Wesleyan standpoint on this issue. That God is still God. We agree with our Calvin brothers and sisters all the way. God has the power. He has the authority. But is He steering us the way a person does a car? My car's out in the parking lot. Without me, it's going to sit there. Unless I take the key and I sit down in that car and start pushing buttons and turning things and pressing pedals, that car's going to sit there. I have total control over my car when I am in it. And unless there is a mechanical failure, if my car crashes, I don't get to blame the car. It's me, right? Excuse me. Some of us see God that way. We think He's driving us. I think a better illustration is guiding us. That He shows us where to go. God says, you're the middle manager, but I'm still the boss of this company. I'm going to show you where to go. I'm going to give you the mandate. I'm going to lay out for you what I'm calling you to do. Whether or not you do it, there's going to be consequences. Either good if you do it, bad if you don't in general. But this is the direction I want you to go. Sometimes people choose wrong. Sometimes I choose wrong, and it blows up in my face. Sometimes somebody else chooses wrong, and I get caught in the crossfire. But that doesn't mean that was God's plan. It doesn't mean that He set that in motion that way. He knew it would happen. That does not mean He caused it to happen. Madeleine L'Engle, who's a Christian author, she wrote this at one point. The problem of pain, of war, and of the horror of war, of poverty and disease is always confronting us. But a God who allows no pain, no grief, also allows no choice. There is little unfairness in a colony of ants, but there's also little freedom. God chose, in my eyes, to give us freedom. How we exercise that freedom will affect how we live in our world. And that leads to our second thing. We have influence in our world. We do. We are not at the whim of everything that happens around us and to us. We have a role in our destiny. Why does that get to be important? Because without that belief, we become very passive in our faith. Why witness to that person? If God wants them in the kingdom, they'll be in the kingdom. If He doesn't want them, they won't. So we don't need to share our faith. We don't need to try to live it out in front of them. I would reject that because the Bible spends so much time telling us to do those things. Why try in this situation? There's nothing I can do. Why go to the doctor? Either I'm going to live or I'm going to die. Why try? Because God gives us this middle management role where He says, here's a direction I want you to go. I want you to pursue it. I want you to do your part. And then trust me for the outcome. Suffering. How many of us have either known, don't raise your hand, but how many of us have been the person who does something like fudge the numbers when they're filling out their application for a housing loan, get a house that they can't afford, and then get mad at God when it goes into foreclosure? We don't want to admit it, but a lot of us have that inside of us, don't we? We have the ability to affect the life around us. We have that. By giving us dominion, God gives us the ability to choose how we will use it. Are we going to use it to build His kingdom, or are we going to use it to try to build our own? Are we going to use the dominion, the authority, to try to make our world a better place, to try to be salt and light and influence it, to be who God calls it to be, what it should look like? Are we going to try to do good? Are we going to try to love our neighbor, to show His grace to people? Or are we going to choose bad? Are we going to choose to serve self, to step on others to get what we want to get? We have influence. How we influence depends on how we allow God to lead us. So some of you are going to know the name Adam Hamilton. Adam Hamilton wrote a great book called Half-Truths, and I'll use it for several of the things in this series, not all of them, but he wrote about several of the topics we use. And Adam Hamilton, he did a whole chapter on this idea of there's a reason for everything. He did a whole chapter on that. And in it, he tells a story I found kind of intriguing. Adam one day was alone. His family, I don't know if they're out of town or what, but it was just him, and he's going to go and he's going to eat a little lunch. So he's almost to the restaurant he's going to eat at. And you ever get that little nudge from God, that little Holy Spirit moment where He's speaking to you? God says, no, I want you to eat over here. I want you to go to this restaurant instead. I don't know, it feels like God's leading to me, so he goes to the other restaurant. And no sooner does he walk in than there's a young lady who looks up at him and her eyes get big, says, Pastor Adam, I needed you so much. I was just praying, God, do you still remember me? Do you still know I'm here? God, give me some sign that you still care about me. And I look up and there you are. And she begins to pour out a situation in life, and Adam was able to help her. And later he wrote about this, and he said this. He said, was it just a coincidence? Maybe. Or was it a God incidence? A situation where God led me to be in the right place at the right time. I don't believe that everything happens for a reason, but sometimes there is a reason that things happen when we are attentive to God's mission. I think God uses us and works through us as we exercise our dominion in this world. We have free will. What if he would have gone to the other restaurant? He would have had a nice meal and he would have gone home never knowing any of the wiser. But because he listened, he was able to use his free will to choose to follow God and then influence his world for the positive. One other thing I'm not going to get into today, but is very important to acknowledge, God does have a master plan. I'm not going to have time to get into all of this, but God has orchestrated history from the very moment of the cross, or from creation to the cross. And now he is instituting his kingdom on earth, and he will continue to move through the salvation plan of his all the way till his second coming. There is a plan that God has. In Luke 13:4, Jesus is talking, and he's talking about a different topic. He's talking about whether or not your sin is always the cause of your suffering. And he's saying it doesn't work that way. And he tells the story of the Tower of Siloam, which fell, and 18 people died in it. And he asks the question, were they more sinful than other people? No. And he doesn't come out and say it, but there's kind of an implication to me in this verse that this wasn't part of some big plan. This was something terrible that happened. Why would something like that happen? Maybe it's something completely random. Something that Christians don't like to acknowledge, that something can be random. More likely, it's because somebody along the way didn't use wisdom that God had given them to build the tower the way it should have been constructed. Maybe somebody decided to cheat on their building materials. Maybe something happened along those lines, but what was supposed to happen did not happen, and people died because of it. Was that God's plan? No. However, in Genesis 50, verse 20, Joseph is talking to his brothers who had sold him into slavery, and he had ended up rising to the second in command of all of Egypt and helping thousands upon thousands of people to avoid the starvation from this famine they were in. And Joseph looked at his brother and he said, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. There was a plan that was going on there. There are times where God is doing something for a plan. We don't always know the difference. So always move forward as if God is leading you. Always seek to work within his plan. But not everything that happens is part of that plan. And if every single thing that happens to you is part of that plan, trust me, you are way more important than I am. I'm sorry if I'm stepping on toes when I say that. But there are some things that happen that did not happen because God had some sort of greater purpose. And there are some things that happen because God is doing something. I am convinced that the times that suffering happens, God didn't cause it, but he didn't stop it. Why? Because there is some good somehow that will come from it. We don't always get to know what that is this side of heaven. It is so hard when we don't know. This is such a painful topic, and it quickly overlaps anytime we suffer with where is God in the middle of it. I don't know why he allows some things and not others. One of the greatest gifts he has given my wife and I, most of our suffering, he has showed us why. I have met so many people, and you will hear me tell this story often. Forgive me for repeating myself. I worked with teenagers for 12 years. I was a pastor who was always in the middle of life and fun and happiness. And all of a sudden, I ended up being a hospice chaplain. And one of my first patients was a 25-year-old who was dying of his brain being eaten away by a chronic wasting virus. And his dad every day would go to his church and light a candle and say prayers, and then go and watch his son roll around on the floor in a padded room wearing nothing but a diaper and drooling until his son died. And I saw that and I thought, God, why? Can you explain this to me? God said no. I came to realize, John, you don't know where I am in this. You don't know what I am doing, but God, do you know, John, do you know who I am? Do you trust me? That's what I, through time, had to learn to do. We don't see His plan. We don't know when something is part of it and something is random. We don't know where He is or why He allows things. Do we know Him? Can we trust Him to be enough? I'm going to ask the musicians to come forward. Can it be enough to know who He is? And if you need to know who He is, today is Communion Sunday. And we have these little kits. If you haven't gotten one, they are in back. And communion is something that comes together for a few purposes in our life. One thing communion does is it shows us who Jesus is. He loved us so much that He would go to the cross for us, to allow us to be part of Him. And that night, when He instituted communion, He passed around bread and He said, "This is my body broken for you. Take, eat, do this in remembrance of me." Later on in the meal, He took a cup and He passed it to the disciples. And when it came back to Him, He said to them, "Take, drink, do this in remembrance of me." By partaking in the body and the blood of Jesus, we know His love for us. Does that help us trust Him? The other thing that communion does is it acknowledges that we are part of this bigger body, the church. Not just Darrow Road Wesleyan, but the church. Universal, different denominations, different groups. People who all come together across the nations, across the decades, to say we are God's kingdom on earth. We have been given this dominion. When we take communion, it's acknowledging we are part of this greater plan. Do we trust Him enough to lead us in it? Do we trust Jesus for our lives? I invite you to stand as we sing our closing song. Worship Him, think about Him, and allow Him to work in our hearts to help us trust.